So after that message from Big Brother, or I guess in that case, Big Sister, I'm here to welcome you to the 58th University Lecture. The series was started in 1950, and a simple calculation tells you we must have had more than one at some stage, but now we are at one per year, designed to showcase our most distinguished faculty and their accomplishments. Previous lectures have ranged very broadly. Last year we heard about Macbeth and the March of Kings. We've heard about neural networks. We've heard about the Human Genome Project. And to introduce tonight's speaker and his topic, I'd like you to welcome the 10th president of Boston University, Bob Brown.
Good evening. It's a real pleasure to be here and to introduce our tonight's distinguished speaker, Professor George J. Annis. Annis came to Boston University in 1973 as the director of the School of Law Center for Law and Health Sciences. He's been a dynamic member of the BU faculty ever since. In addition to serving as chair of the Department of Health Law, Bioethics, and Human Rights, and as the Edward R. Utley Professor of Health Law in the School of Public Health, Professor Annis also holds faculty appointments in the School of Law and the School of Medicine. He is heralded as one of the nation's leading bioethics ethicists and brings his enormous talents to bear on some of the most contentious and often emotionally charged dilemmas facing our society today. He has authored, co-authored, and edited numerous articles and publications, including his recent monograph, American Bioethics, Crossing Human Rights and Health Law Boundaries. He is a fellow of the American Association of the Advancement of Science and a member of the Institute of Medicine, which is the medical branch of the National Academies. Professor Annis is co-founder of Global Lawyers and Physicians, a nonprofit organization that works to promote health and human rights, and currently serves as co-chair of the American Bar Association's Committee on Health Rights and Bioethics in its Individual Rights and Responsibilities section. Please join me in welcoming Professor George J. Annis, who will present the university lecture titled American Bioethics After Nuremberg, Pragmatism, Politics, and Human Rights. Professor Annis.
Thank you, President Brown, President Shabanian, Provost Campbell, Dean Meenan, distinguished guests, and my friends, especially my friends from the Department of Health Law, Bioethics, and Human Rights. I want to welcome you all tonight. I promise it won't be dull. I'm not used to being called distinguished. That usually means very old. I probably am old. I don't think of myself as very old. But we're gonna spend tonight talking about health law, bioethics, and human rights. And I'm going to make an argument, which I think is correct, but which is actually radical in the field, that it all began at Nuremberg. And if we go back to Nuremberg and recognize our roots, we'll see that these three fields are really united in their origins, in their missions, in their goals, and they should be working together much better than they are. And if they did, and I think they will, they could do a lot more good in the world. So, with that pretty ambitious agenda, let me begin. I did get an email late this afternoon I do want to share with you, this is from the White House. Your ethics lecture has been accredited by the White House Office of General Counsel for White House staff members required to attend an ethics lecture this week. Signed, Harriet Meyer. So that's very sweet. That's very sweet. So those of you who are here from the White House staff tonight to monitor this presentation, know that you're not wasting your time totally. This is from Dick Cheney's office, actually. How about an ethics trifecta? We clone a human, induce octuplets, and assist in their suicides. And that's the way a lot of people think about ethics, and we've got to the point in bioethics now where we wonder if we're just, after 25 years, if we're just chasing the most recent headline. And people argue differently about when bioethics started. A lot of people think it started with heart transplants. or kidney transplants, or brain death definitions. Some people think it started with the Karen Quinlan case, first major case to go to court to say if it's okay to, quote, pull the plug, or if that's illegal. Obviously, that led to physician-assisted suicide. Other people think that the real origins are with the new reproductive technologies, new ways to have babies that have been developed, and even thoughts that in the future we'll be able to do genetic engineering and not just have a healthy baby, but a better baby, right? Other origins are in the surrogate mother case, the Great Baby M case, or just doing decisions about severely handicapped newborns or preemies. We've had a lot of discussion about that in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And any of those points can be seen to be a beginning of American bioethics. Mostly, though, bioethics has been concerned with human experimentation, both the good and the bad. That's President Clinton with Charlie Pollard, one of the few survivors of the Tuskegee experiment, probably our most infamous experiment in the United States. That's Jesse Gelsinger, who did not survive his experiment at the University of Pennsylvania and stopped all gene transfer experiments for a significant period of time. Many of you remember, at least those of you who were around 20 years ago, the first artificial heart with Barney Clark, and one of my favorite or least favorite cases, Baby Faye, who had the world's first baboon heart implanted in her. Thankfully, the last as well, as people realized that that was not something you should do to a human being. And of course, the biggest issue in ethics has been the Human Genome Project and genetics, primarily because the Genome Project decided to use 10% of its budget, actually 3 to 5% of its budget, to fund so-called ELSI projects, ethics, law, and social policy implications. So genetics has been a good full employment project for ethicists. My friends in the transhumanist community look forward to the day when they won't, if they're not forever young, at least they'll never die. And a lot of people see that as a goal. I'm not one of them, but you may be, and that's okay. I can understand that. Americans are a group that some people think death is optional. And we certainly would like to think that in many ways, although then we have to wonder, why did we have this national convulsion over Terri Schiavo, a young woman, at least she was young when she first fell into a persistent, soon after, a permanent vegetative state, got her husband, as we would think from the Quinlan case and the Krzan case, making decisions for her. But no, we had to have the head doctor of the Senate, Bill Frist, had to diagnose her by videotape. The most long-distance diagnosis of persistent vegetative state in the history of American medicine. Well, he said he'd seen them, but that wasn't it. That wasn't one, he didn't think. So we had Congress meeting at midnight. You still remember this? This was only 6 months ago. On Palm Sunday to pass emergency legislation for one patient, Terri Schiavo. And that's extremely difficult to explain, even 6 months later. It obviously had a lot to do with the intermeshing now of ethics and religion, and maybe religion, at least in some circles, taking over for ethics and making decisions not based on what one might argue should be done from the best arguments, but what some people believe by reading the Bible or something else must be done for religious reasons. Probably isn't a God gene, but the fact that we're even talking about whether there's a God gene is bizarre enough. We may or may not still remember, I'll remember September 11th, but we may not remember August 9th, which is the month before that, when the president gave what he said was the most important speech in his presidency. And he expected it to be the most important decision in his presidency. And it was about federal funding for stem cells. And he decided, as many of you will remember, probably most of you, that it was ethical for the federal government to fund embryonic stem cell research for embryos that had already been created and used to make stem cells, where he said the life and death decision had already been made, but it was unethical and wrong for the federal government to fund any other stem cell research. And I think we know what happened about that. Many states, including Massachusetts, decided that they'd take on the burden of funding stem cell research and working on it. And if the federal government didn't want to do it, that was fine. Related to that, the real issue, even though this was a political issue about embryonic stem cells, the real issue was human cloning and making babies. And the administration refused to let Congress, and still has refused, to let Congress ban human cloning to make a baby unless Congress also bans human embryonic cloning to use embryos to make stem cells. We can talk about this. It will be a question and answer period. I think that's an insane and indefensible position. Most of the current administration's views on ethics have stemmed from their views on abortion. I don't think that's very controversial. And most of those have stemmed from their views of the Supreme Court, and that a court that would restrict abortion is likely also to not favor same-sex marriage, to favor more religion in the public square, and to be more amenable to what fundamentalist religions think a law should look like in the United States. Finally, I've gone through all these examples just to give you a feel for whether bioethics is really just chasing the latest headline or has some core. All medical examples, and we should, since I'm at the School of Public Health, we should have mentioned at least one public health example, which is the bird flu. And everybody has a position on the bird flu, and I'm not here to argue that, but just driving over here tonight, even if any of those listening to NPR heard this report about the whole large groups of people on the internet, bloggers, talking about how to stock up for the bird flu, what kind of provisions they need, and there's a whole movement in this country to be self-sufficient when the pandemic strikes, because nobody thinks government is going to be able to do anything. Well, we can talk about that too. But public health is one area. Bioethics, which has really been medical ethics, hasn't really talked about or addressed very well. And public health and globalization are the two main forces, I think, have to move bioethics into the real world, which is to deal with human rights on a global level. Now, that's what's been going on for the last 25 years. It used to be a simpler time in this world. When I was growing up, Bob Brown and I were talking before about how in the 50s students used to come to school with coat and tie on. Well, I can't remember that. That's before my time. But before World War II, I can tell you, all you had to know about medical ethics was the Boy Scout law. I don't know if we have any Boy Scouts here today, but here we do. So the Boy Scouts know the Boy Scout law, right? That a scout is trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Right? Only a Boy Scout can do that. But what doctors know is that that's all they had to know about medical ethics before World War II. Right? The first 6 is what patients want from their doctors. They want to be trustworthy, loyal, helpful, friendly, courteous, kind, obedient, courteous. And the last 6, are what? Doctors want from their patients. They want to be obedient, cheerful, thrifty, brave, clean, and reverent. Right? And literally, that's all you had to know in medical ethics before World War II. It was a simpler time. Now it's complex. This caption is, I also do suicides. Even scouting ain't what it used to be, right? But the old scouting motto, be prepared, is still a good one for public health preparedness, right? And this is what medical ethics has brought. This is a legal view of medical ethics that I've argued for years, that really ethics turns into law, because that's really what the doctors want to know about most, is can I be sued or will I be liable? And this is an artist's rendition of a physician surrounded by lawyers here, and which is another way to say that's modern health law. And many people feel that way. Modern bioethics is this, Rembrandt's picture of an ethics committee. And the major gift of bioethics to the medical profession has in fact been the ethics committee, whether it's the IRB, whether it's a real ethics committee to help them in consultation, and whether it is really ethics is something that I think is worth looking at again. Now, here we are in 2005, and one question that's worth looking at is, well, what does American bioethics mean today? Does it mean something? Does it have something useful for humanity and for society? Well, the president, when he gave his speech about stem cells in August of 2001, also set up a presidential bioethics council. In doing that, he was following in the footsteps of President Clinton, who had followed in the footsteps of presidents before him, in having a presidential bioethics council, a group of advisors, people to advise him, theoretically at least, on bioethics issues. And Leon Kass, big-time bioethicist, was named the chairman. And Dr. Kass has a view, and it was the view of his council and the view of this administration's bioethicist, if you will, which is that what we have to worry about is a dystopia described by Huxley in Brave New World. That the worst thing that can happen is that we'll start reproducing in hatcheries, as they did that children will become commodified, that we'll try to have babies made to order, and that we will, in our lives, be drugged and be happy to take drugs so we feel good, and that essentially, ultimately, we will drain life of all of its meaning and will become like contented cows, in Huxley and Leon's view. And that's the vision. That's what bioethics should spend all their time worrying about, is how to prevent that. Now, there's a lot to be said for that, all right? But there may be more to bioethics than just worrying about embryos, new reproductive technologies put together with genetics to make better babies and to commodify humans in the future. Especially a month after his appointment, when the World Trade Center was attacked and when the president and others decided that we had entered in a new kind of war. To me, that raised the question pretty quickly. Well, does American bioethics have anything to say about this? Do bioethicists have anything to say about this? Or is this something totally different, even though it's the only topic on everyone's mind, and it's literally transforming the world based on how we would react to that situation? In fact, I think it's safe to say that following September 11th, the real parable that we had to worry about and think about was not Brave New World, although that didn't go away, but 1984, and a government literally in perpetual war, which the president said we were in, right, that would have no end, that terrorized the citizenry, that called for tremendous power consolidated in the central government, called for secrecy, and called for unprecedented action, which we'll talk about. Called for setting up Guantanamo. We all know lots about Guantanamo now. We didn't know a lot about it when it first was set up. We know the administration set up this prison in Guantanamo Naval Base as a place which they believed no U.S. law applied, so that they could have an interrogation center that was free from meddling U.S. courts, get involved in that. And that led very quickly to use of excessive force, use of torture, use of inhumane and degrading treatment, which led to Abu Ghraib. And one of the most disturbing things to me about Abu Ghraib is how little reaction there was on the public's part to the expose by these pictures of what was going on there. It led Elie Wiesel to say, where are the lawyers? Where are the military doctors? Where's the outrage at American soldiers abusing and torturing Muslim prisoners? And he was absolutely right to ask that question. And he could continue to ask that question. Things are changing a little bit. But this idea of American soldiers engaged in torture takes us back to Nuremberg. And it took a while to get to Nuremberg, but now we're there. And this is where it all started. This is the courthouse at Nuremberg, Nuremberg, Germany, obviously, after World War II. And Nuremberg was the city chosen to do the International War Crimes Tribunal for a couple of reasons. Most important, I think, is it was in the American sector, and the Americans were the country most interested in doing the war crimes trials. But also it had this courthouse that was still standing. 95% of Nuremberg was destroyed, but the courthouse was still standing. And it offered a place to do the trials. And there were two trials, one big trial and one set of trials. The first trial, the most important trial, although not for us, but the most important trial for world history, was the International Military Tribunal. It was the first multinational trial in world history, literally. There were judges from the Allied powers in Europe, from the Soviet Union, from France, from Great Britain, and the United States, two judges each, to try the major war criminals who were still alive after the war. And that court ended with a judgment on what we now call the Nuremberg Principles. And they're familiar to all of you, whether you know them as the Nuremberg Principles or not. And they are, very simply, that there are such things as war crimes and crimes against humanity, that individuals can be held accountable for committing war crimes and crimes against humanity, and that the defense, I was just obeying orders, not apply, right? Not a valid defense. Okay, so that was the law in those tribunals, in that tribunal. International law recognized essentially by everyone. After that trial, the other allies decided that was enough. They wanted to go home. There were military tribunals going on in Germany as well. But the United States decided to stay on and have 12 additional trials of the various sectors of German society during the war to try to create a record of what had happened. There were also individual military tribunals, like the one, not exactly like the ones that may happen someday at Guantanamo that we keep getting threatened with, but the military actually did real tribunals at least 500 of them around Germany. One was at Dachau. This is the entrance to Dachau. But the major trial the U.S. did of the doctors was the first so-called subsequent trial at Nuremberg, the doctors' trial. And that's where I believe American bioethics was born. And lots of things are real important to learn, to think about this trial. The first is that this was an American trial. British are gone, French are gone, Soviets are gone. The Americans continue on with this trial. These are all American judges, state judges, brought in from the United States to hear this trial. But it's also a military trial. It is run by the military in the military sector based on U.S. civilian law, however, and now international law that had just been decreed. And this is the named defendant, Karl Brandt, although there are 23 physicians and scientist defendants in this trial. And the prosecutors, you can see prosecutors are mostly civilians. A lot of them right out of law school. A lot of them right from Boston, right out of Harvard Law School. And the chief prosecutor, Telford Taylor, is a general, is a military guy. General Taylor set forth the reasons why this trial was important in his opening speech. For the prosecution. And he said this to the judges: the defendants in this case are charged with murders, tortures, and other atrocities committed in the name of medical science. The charges against them are brought in the name of the United States, of America. They are being tried by a court of American judges, we know that. To kill, to maim, and to torture is criminal under all modern systems of law. But these defendants did not kill in hot blood and are not ignorant men. Most of them are trained physicians, yet they are responsible for wholesale murder and unspeakably cruel torture. Taylor continued, the perverse thoughts and distorted concepts which brought about these savageries are not dead. They cannot be killed by force of arms. They must not become a spreading cancer in the breast of humanity. They must be cut out and exposed for the reasons so well stated by Mr. Justice Jackson, prosecutor in the big trial, in this courtroom a year ago. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated. And General Taylor was talking specifically about the so-called medical experiments that the Nazi doctors were engaged in. The two most infamous or well-known ones are the so-called freezing experiments, where physicians took measurements on how long it took someone literally to freeze to death in various clothing that their fighter pilots might be wearing when they bailed out in the North Sea. They wanted to learn how you could best prevent death in cold water, although they did induce death to try to figure this out. And the other are the high altitude experiments, where they simulated a bailout from high altitude, 60,000, 40,000 feet, to see at what level you could bail out without dying. And many of those subjects died in those experiments. As Jay Katz, probably the leading expert on the Nazi experiments, a psychiatrist at Yale Law School, has pointed out, what made the Nazi experiments different, I mean, there were some pretty horrible experiments that other people had done, but different than experiments that doctors had ever done before, was that death was a planned endpoint, and that they were done on an industrial scale. They were done to thousands and thousands of people. The judges at Nuremberg, the American judges now, developed what we now know as the Nuremberg Code, distinct from the Principles. This is a code about medical research, a very famous Nuremberg Code. Point one of which is that the consent of the subject is absolutely required for legitimate human experimentation. The judges went on to explain that consent has to be voluntary, competent, informed, and understanding. The first principle of the Nuremberg Code. The ninth principle is that subjects have a right to withdraw at any time. Those are known as the two basic rights that subjects of experimentation have, the judges said, universally, not just in the Nazi concentration camps, but everywhere. And the code also had 8 welfare provisions that related to protecting the interests of subjects by requiring that risks be minimized, that only qualified scientists perform the experiments, that they be willing to stop the experiment at any time, and that they not do experiments on human beings where they think death or disabling injury is likely to occur. That code, again, an American code developed by American judges sitting in judgment at Nuremberg with American prosecutors and American physicians acting as experts, especially Leo Alexander and Andrew Ivy. That is the basic code, legal code, ethical code for human experimentation. One of the subtitles of this talk is pragmatism, and Americans are known as pragmatists, and sometimes that's good. But after the war, it became, I think, bad. But let's talk about it. Americans decided that, at least our government decided, well, we had to know, since we just invented the atomic bomb and used it and planned to make lots more, we had to know more about radiation exposure. And so American scientists and researchers after World War II exposed a lot of Americans to research, to radiation, to see how they would react. Mostly without their consent, almost always without their knowing what was going on. Not with death as its endpoint, sometimes with ideas that this could cure people. Some of this was done in hospitals, although it seemed unlikely. But this was all done in secret, and it really didn't become public until the Clinton administration, at which time we had major exposés, major studies, lots of information about these experiments, how they violated the Nuremberg Code, how the Nuremberg Code was ignored, how in fact, even though the military in 1953 under President Eisenhower, who was a supreme Allied commander in Europe, obviously, during the Nuremberg trials, and was quite taken with them and actually was in charge of them, had the U.S. military adopt the Nuremberg Code formally as U.S. military policy. But for whatever reason, and no one really knows why, it was labeled top secret. It wasn't that it was a secret, but it was actually not declassified until 1972. We think we have problems with classification and security today. Nonetheless, it simply wasn't followed. And the reason it wasn't followed is because our scientists thought they had to know this information, that national security was more important than the Nuremberg Code. Of course, it wasn't just an experimentation. The U.S. was in a giant race with the Soviets to grab German scientists. And it turned out that our German scientists were better than their German scientists, right? And Wernher von Braun was the reason we got to the moon before the Soviets did. Well, Wernher was also the inventor of the V-2 rocket, ran a rocket camp in Germany where more people died in slave labor working for him than were killed in London with all the bombs that were rained down on London from his rockets. But we rehabilitated Wernher. Not all Nazis are so bad, right? If they could help us. Again, it's our pragmatic streak, and we certainly have it. We also have an idealistic streak, though. And while this was going on behind the scenes, the United States was hard at work. Eleanor Roosevelt being the chief draftsperson, writing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which was adopted almost unanimously, without dissent, by the United Nations in 1948, with the premise that all human beings have human dignity, and all human beings should be treated equally under the law and everywhere else throughout the world, both in terms of politics and in terms of economics. Well, because the Cold War was going on, we weren't able to get a treaty that incorporated all of the provisions of the Declaration, and instead we got two treaties. One the United States liked a lot, the one on civil and political rights, and one the Soviet Union liked a lot, the one on economic, social and cultural rights. For our purposes tonight, the most important thing to know is that the treaty, which we signed, which grew directly out of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 7 states, just as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights does in Article 5, no one shall be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. In the treaty that we signed, this phrase was added to make sure Nuremberg never happened again. That's what the draftspeople said. In particular, no one shall be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. That treaty was endorsed in 1966, put out for signature, signed by the United States, part of U.S. law today. Since the 70s, I'd say, probably since the beginning of the AIDS epidemic, research in the United States has been radically transformed, all right, to talk about. And we know this, we all know this. It's no longer seen as something, at least by most people, that is suspect, as certainly it was at Nuremberg, and certainly it was in the U.S. in the 50s, as something that's dangerous to people. Rather, it's seen as treatment, as something that's new, as something that's desirable, especially in the areas of cancer and AIDS. ACT UP, you probably will recall, demonstrated around the country and around the world for the right to be research subjects, for the right to use whatever drugs were available, whether they were proven safe and effective or not. This is a recent cartoon I like a lot. Unfortunately, there's no cure. There's not even a race for a cure. Because the race for the cure is the experiment, right? And we now see that as a good thing, not a bad thing. We are engaged in what my friend Professor Katz, same J. Katz I mentioned before, has pointed out, which is a therapeutic illusion. Some people call it the therapeutic misconception. That today, most subjects of experiments, at least sick people who are in experiments, don't see them as experiments at all. They see them as treatment. We're no longer able to distinguish research from treatment, the scientist from the doctor, or the subject from the patient. And it matters. As J. Katz would say if he was here today, it really does matter. Because if you don't do this, physicians are literally taking advantage of their patients to convert them into research subjects, to use them for their own good. And subjects are volunteering for research under the illusion that it's treatment. All right. What's the difference? In treatment, the doctor does what he and the patient believe is best for the patient. If it doesn't work, you try something else. In research, the scientist's obligation, who may also be a doctor, is to follow the protocol, to test a hypothesis, to find new knowledge. It may or may not benefit the patient subject, but that's not the purpose of it. That's totally incidental. And the reason why U.S. News has this cover, "Dying for a Cure," is because people do literally die for cures, especially in phase 1 cancer research. Jesse Gelsinger was an example that we saw before. And we are left with this problematic research enterprise that we say is looked over by IRBs, or our ethics committees, our institutional review boards. Boston University has been involved in this subject for a long time. You might say, why haven't we done better with it? And I just want to spend a couple seconds on that. The Law of Medicine Institute, one of the first such institutes of its kind, was formed at Boston University in 1958 and published this book in 1963, the first collection of articles on human experimentation ever published, anywhere as far as I can tell, but certainly in the United States. In the 1970s, the Center for Law and Health Sciences at Boston University wrote the informed consent background papers for the National Commission, which wrote the first regulations for human research in this country, and relied heavily on the Nuremberg Code and made sure that the code provisions were considered, seriously considered by the drafters of those regulations. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, we did a lot more work on the Nuremberg Code here at Boston University. We held this a large meeting in 1989, out of which the book came, and then on the 50th anniversary of the Nuremberg Code, my colleague Michael Groden and I hosted the meeting at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington on the 50th anniversary of the Nuremberg Code. We're coming up on the 60th anniversary, and it's certainly time to do something more than that. Besides being the major human rights document in human research, the Nuremberg Code points us, I think, in the human rights direction and shows us, I will argue now for the rest of the talk, that in order to move out of its embryocentric, American-centric, kind of what's new modality in medicine, American bioethics has to not only take public health seriously, but take global human rights seriously and get back to the core of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that all human beings really are equal, that equality really does matter, that poverty really is a major human rights problem, obviously a major health problem as well, and that a lot of poverty is related to racism. And if American bioethics doesn't at least try to deal with those subjects, it's becoming more and more irrelevant. My friend and colleague, Jonathan Mann, had the insight when he was the head of UN AIDS 15 years ago now, that you can't really deal with health on an international level, especially in the AIDS pandemic, without dealing with human rights. And he founded the whole new field of study called Health and Human Rights, which I think is absolutely right, that Michael Groden and I have been working in as well with his encouragement. He tragically died in a Swiss Air crash on his way to the UN to consider whether to go back to work for them. But Jonathan's work continues, and his insight was absolutely right. If you want to have an impact on health in the world, you have to work on health and human rights together, and especially the right to health, which is one of the core rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We tend to think about human rights, and whenever I talk about human rights with people, I say, oh yeah, that's murder and torture. You go right back to Nuremberg, and if you're more with it, you say murder, torture, genocide, and slavery. Those are the big crimes against humanity, war crimes, and those are what Americans think about when they think about human rights. the rest of the world thinks about human rights. They think about that, yes, but also more important, or as importantly, they think about the right to health, the positive rights. And physicians have been way ahead, way out front on this. These are 5 physician groups working in human rights. You've heard of at least 4 of them, I'm sure. Doctors Without Borders, Physicians for Human Rights here in Boston, IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. Those 3 are famous because they've all won the Nobel Peace Prize. All right. 2 others, local ones, Partners in Health, Paul Farmer's group, Global Lawyers and Physicians, Dr. Groden and my group, work in this same area. We haven't won the Nobel Prize yet, but we will. But the point is that physicians actually understand this. It's not an anti, it's not that physicians really get it more, I think, unfortunately, than some of my legal colleagues, although physicians also understand that their work can be much more effective if they work with lawyers in concert, because both fields, both law and medicine, have the great advantage of being transnational and are not bounded, if they don't want to be bounded, by national boundaries, and can work internationally. Most of the prosecutors at Nuremberg, including Telford Taylor and others, most of them are dead now, but most of them spent the rest of their lives trying to get the world to start what they called a permanent Nuremberg tribunal. Right? That Nuremberg was an ad hoc tribunal set up after the war to try the Nazis. There was another one in Japan, less successful, to try the Japanese war criminals. But it was a one-shot thing. And they believed, as most international lawyers believe, that what we really need is a permanent Nuremberg. What we now have is the International Criminal Court. And we need that to try to enforce human rights violations. All right? It's one thing to say, be nice, yes, it's bad to violate human rights. It's another thing to actually give it some teeth. After the doctor's trial, 7 doctors were found not guilty. The rest were found guilty, and 7 of those were hung. Now, capital punishment is no longer looked at with favor in the international community, but life sentences are and are still reasonable. The question is, can we enforce crimes against humanity and war crimes? We now actually do have the Treaty of Rome and the International Criminal Court. The United States, I'm sure you all know, have refused to sign on to this, have refused to ratify and join the International Criminal Court. And that's a scandal. That's our court. I mean, everything in the basis of it was from Nuremberg. It's from all the groundwork was laid by the United States. All the basic crimes were laid out by the United States. And to see the United States repudiate Nuremberg is a tragedy. And to see pictures like this is, again, Elie Wiesel's question, how is it possible? It's absolutely right. How is it possible for American soldiers to pose the way the Nazis posed with their victims? This is at Abu Ghraib. This is Hamadin El-Jamadi, who, if everyone will know about him this week because his story is laid out in graphic detail in this week's New Yorker. Kind of strange look for the New Yorker as breaking stories about human rights, but they have. Seymour Hersh has written a whole series in there. Jane Mayer's story this week it breaks new ground. And one of the things that we can take some consolation from in bioethics is that the person who did some of the basic work on this case is a bioethicist, thank God, Dr. Stephen Miles from the University of Minnesota, and he's quoted at length there, and his research in this case is quoted at length. And in addition, other people have looked at all the medical records, and there are medical records available, believe it or not, from this case. 2 of my colleagues, old friend Cyril Wecht, who's the coroner in Pittsburgh, and Michael Baden, who was the former medical examiner in New York, people with impeccable credentials, agree based on the records, they haven't seen the body, that this gentleman died while being tortured. He was, as we would put it in the vernacular, murdered. All right? Well, do we care? The U.S. Senate, 90-9 last month, in like an incredible gesture, incredible because the Republicans have never voted against the president in the last 5 years, and an incredible repudiation of Bush, said that we want to pass a statute saying that we really do believe what we said in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that you can't torture people, that you can't use cruel and degrading treatment, that you really can't we can't countenance this, that we really meant what we said when we signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that we meant what we said when we signed the Torture Treaty. 90-9 again, the U.S. pledges never to torture anyone in U.S. custody. Well, we didn't say we did it, but we'll never do it again. All right? This is what John McCain said on the Senate floor. Let me first review the history. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, states simply, no one shall be subjected to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, to which the United States is a signatory, states the same. All right? McCain went on after that to talk more, but he's making the point that we all know now, right? That these rights grew right out of Nuremberg. The U.S. has signed on to. The U.S. has been a leader in prohibiting torture around the world. McCain went on to talk about the Geneva Conventions, how important they are, that we follow them, how important they were to him and his fellow U.S. soldiers when they were being tortured in Vietnam, and how the only thing that kept him going, and he says this to the U.S. Senate, was knowing that we were better than they were, that we would not torture if they were our prisoners, that we would uphold basic human rights. So how does the administration react to this? The president has threatened to veto that legislation, and the vice president, our buddy Cheney, who started this talk, went to visit McCain last week. You probably all know the story by now, and said, Senator, I understand the military not torturing people in Geneva Convention. Okay, we'll agree to that, but can't we make an exception for my CIA guys? We've got 8 black ops situations around the world where we are holding people, and we just like to be able to torture them if we think it's necessary. We only do it, if we think it's okay. And to his credit, obviously, McCain threw him out of his office. And I'm told, I usually watch Jon Stewart, but I didn't watch him the night before last, that he had McCain on as a guest, and he asked McCain, is Cheney insane? And that's the right question. Maybe it takes a comedian to answer, but that's the real question. Has the United States government gone insane when we want it to be U.S. policy that we are war criminals? That not just we countenance torture, that we countenance murder? And as I've asked some of my colleagues, if it's okay to torture and murder, why wouldn't it be okay to bring the person's family in there and kill their children in front of them? People really do talk when you torture their children. They don't necessarily talk when you torture them. If that's all you care about is pragmatism, maybe that's what we should be. But I think most Americans, and I think actually the 90-9 vote in the Senate mirrors most Americans, and I think it's about that. It's about 90% of Americans think this is horrific, and we should get back to basic human rights, whereas it's the 9% that Cheney represents, the dark side of America, if you will, that thinks that we should be as bad as the people that we're fighting, and that's the way we'll win the war, ultimate war on ideas in the future. Not likely, right? So we're back looking at Nuremberg from the vantage point of 9/11 and our reactions and overreaction and misreactions to it, and we can think of T.S. Eliot's great poem "Little Gideon." Lots of people use it, but it's still worth using, which he actually wrote when he was on fire duty in London at night during the bombing, when Wernher von Braun's V-2 rockets were coming over London. And he said, you remember this, that we will not cease from exploration. And at the end of all our exploring, we will arrive where we began. and know the place for the first time. Right? And that's why I think, that we understand Nuremberg today, is looking at for the soul of America, looking for the beginning of the international human rights movement, looking for the beginning of the bioethics movement, actually even looking for the beginning of health law as a field when doctors and lawyers worked together at Nuremberg to come up with the Nuremberg Code, and when the international community came up with human rights. Now, just in conclusion, we could say, well, even if you don't, say, well, that's a plausible argument for American bioethics beginning at Nuremberg, and therefore doctors and lawyers should be the main movers in bioethics and have the most to say about it, and doctors and lawyers should work together in the human rights field. But aren't there other plausible historical beginnings for medical ethics? And there are a couple, and I just want to mention two. One is Hippocrates, although my colleague Michael Gross says we don't really have a picture of Hippocrates, we don't know what he looks like. There's a famous painting with Hippocrates rejecting the gifts of the Persians who want him to come and help the military, which is being devastated by a plague, the Persian military. And Hippocrates is saying, no, my country first. We've now come to look at medical neutrality as being very important, and we don't think military physicians should put their country first. We think they should put medical ethics first. Nonetheless, we can look at Hippocrates from his other works as being the beginning of medical ethics. We could look at my favorite painting, the Raft of the Medusa, as being the beginning of medical ethics. Well, how the hell could we do that? This was 1818. This was the picture of the raft. Many of you know the story. It was a French frigate on its way to Senegal in Africa to help, among other things, in the slave trade. And the ship sunk. 150 people were cast away on a raft. This is 14 days later. There obviously aren't 150 people left on that raft. They went through murder, cannibalism, every horrible thing you could think of. And just before they were rescued, when Jericho paints this portrait of them before their rescue, Dr. Savignon, actual physician, André Savignon, who was one of the survivors, did a calculation that they had enough food for 15 people to survive 3 days. But if everybody ate, and that at the time there were more than 30 people on the raft, if everybody ate, it would only last a day, and they'd all die. So he picked out the sickest people on the raft and had them thrown overboard. That could be the beginning of medical ethics. How do you make decisions in emergency? Should the doctors do it? How do you do rationing? That's heavy-duty rationing, right? And you could look at that as a beginning. You could also look at this portrait, as has been argued by others, as the beginning of the abolitionist movement, or the end of the abolitionist movement in France, because Jericho did what was not true in real life, was put a black person on the top of this mast, waving for rescue and being the herald of the future, of equality being the herald of the future. And so that you could see at the beginning of human rights and medical ethics. Also in 1818, my favorite book was published, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which can also be seen as the beginning of medical ethics, even though Frankenstein, although I'll call him Dr. Frankenstein, was no doctor, obviously. But he did things that we think of doctors doing today. Or I guess we do, like trying to create life out of dead body parts, or trying to go beyond cloning and make people with wings, or trying to do all these weird things that my post-humanist friends want us to do. So you could see 1818 as the beginning of medical ethics. But I think we're better off sticking where we were with the Nuremberg Code and with the doctor's trial. I actually think that makes the most sense as the beginning of medical ethics. Now, what about today? We're a long ways from Nuremberg. It's only, 60 years ago, but it seems a long ways away. Medicine's come a long way. President Brown mentioned we've had lectures, this university lecture, on the Human Genome Project. Human Genome Project has been one of the great triumphs in science of the last decade. What does the Human Genome teach us that's relevant for tonight?
Well, I've argued, and I'll argue tonight, that the Nuremberg Code, but especially the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, can be seen as a great code of values for all humanity, not just the public health people. I think it should be seen as the ethics code for public health as well. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is our values code. The genome is a scientific code, a biological code, if you will. What do the two have to do with each other? Well, actually, I think they intermesh very well when we talk about and think about human dignity and equality. After the genome was decoded, and you can see this is not all that different than Jericho's painting with a prominent black person here, and we learned from genomics what we pretty much knew from the fossil records, that all humanity started in Africa, right? And as one of the scientists from London said after the genome was published, he put it kind of nicely, I thought. He said, we're all Africans under the skin. Basically, we're all the same, right? And that's what the human genome shows. Well, it doesn't happen automatically. You have to put the human genome together with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we do come out that way, that we are all the same. And that is a powerful insight, and we can't go any further in the international community without that insight. And it's not an original insight, but I want to end with President Kennedy's famous speech at American University. And you have to set the stage for this. I lived through this, I'm old enough to remember, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and how close the world came to a nuclear exchange, potentially an annihilating nuclear exchange. And obviously President Kennedy was not real happy with the Soviet Union, or Khrushchev at the time. And he did see them as our enemies. Right? And we all saw them as our deadly enemies. Nonetheless, within 6 months after the missile crisis was resolved, Kennedy went to American University and gave a speech, a famous speech, and at the end of the speech he said, very famous words, right? Let us not be blind to our differences. I'm talking about the Soviets, right? Let's not be blind to our differences, he said. But let us also attend to our common interests, right? For our most common link, he said, is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal. And he was absolutely right. Unless we adopt a universal language, see our fellow human beings as the same as us, unless we, to use my grouping tonight, unite human rights, bioethics, because doctors are very helpful and very special, and health law in a way that can work together for humanity's enrichment and improvement, we're in real trouble. We can do it. We're not doing well now as a country, but I think as a people we understand where we want to go, and our challenge now is to convince our government that it's going in the wrong direction. Thank you very much.
I believe Professor Annis will be glad to take a few questions. There are some. There are mics out in the audience.
There better be some. I mean, you can feel free to just accept everything I've said, of course. But, I would hope we'd have at least. Yeah, there are mics. You can use that. Thank you.
Thank you for a very distressing but very good talk. I wonder what you think about the role of the press in our failure to have the kind of outrage that you have mentioned. In particular, if you read the paper today, for instance, there's an article buried deep in the pages that American troops used white phosphorus bombs in Fallujah last year. but that's a chemical weapon. Why was it not a headline? What has happened to the press? Or we read that at Guantanamo, people are using force feeding. You see that in the foreign press, but we don't read it here. Presumably doctors are taking part in that. I know psychologists are, but the outrage, is it not partly because people don't know about it? What is happening?
Boy, I mean, tell me. I mean, you're right. The press has, the Defense Department was brilliant in embedding the press during the Iraq War and making them part of the war effort, right? I think we've seen a little shift since Katrina. I mean, I think a lot of the press understood after Katrina that all this preparedness stuff was a myth, that we were not ready for anything, let alone ready for some kind of an attack. We're not even ready for a hurricane. On the other hand, you're absolutely right. I didn't see the phosphorus thing today. No, that's bad. Force feeding's been going on at Guantanamo for at least 6 months, and there's been almost no attention to it in the U.S. press, although Charlie Savage of the Globe has written about it a couple of times. But I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I really don't know the answer to that. But I think you're right that if the press doesn't get involved and be what the press is supposed to be, which is skeptical of any administration, not just this one, but any administration, and question things and require the administration to explain itself, then we're left with the bloggers, right, and the internet, and that's not good enough. That's good, but not good enough. No. So I don't know the answer to that. We may have some journalists here. If we do, we'll ask them what the hell's the matter with their colleagues. But I do think, and again, this New Yorker piece is really, there's not a lot of subtlety in this piece. So I think things are changing slowly, slower than I'd like, but they're changing.
I want to ask you about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that was adopted in 1946. Why hasn't it done better? Why aren't things better if it was adopted in 1946? If you look at the division between the rich countries and the poor countries, you look at the burden of disease in poor countries versus rich countries, does it actually matter?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question, and you're not the only one to ask. Well, yeah, we have these great declarations and these wonderful statements about how we're all brothers and everybody should love one another and we should all help each other, and the world's going to hell at the same time, right? Everything gets more miserable and miserable. And there are two answers to that, right? One is to be very cynical and to say, this is all bullshit, right? And there's certainly a lot of evidence to support that. And it's easy to be cynical. The other is to take some consolation in the fact that things in many places are actually getting better. That this is a slow process. That first you have a declaration. It's like we had our Declaration of Independence, which is not law. It doesn't require anybody to do anything, but it's a statement of principles or aspirations, an ethical statement, if you will. After that, we develop treaties. We have. It takes a while, but the treaty on, the one John McCain referred to in his speech, he thinks that's real, and so do I, and so does everybody else. That's on civil and political rights. The treaty on economic, social, and cultural rights, which the United States has not signed, is the one that talks about the right to health, the right to development, the right to helping other countries develop, etc. We should sign that, obviously. We should help other countries develop. We haven't gotten there yet. That doesn't mean we never will. And in terms of the right to health in those countries that have adopted that, we are taking steps to define that. Comment 14, which the treaty body that is set up to enforce that treaty has defined what they mean now by the right to health in very explicit detail, just in the year 2001. Set benchmarks for it, sets a reporting system for it. Countries are only required to do this within their resources, progressive realization, and you can get very frustrated with that. It sounds like the Supreme Court in 1954 with desegregation. But it's all moving, as long as it's moving in that direction, I'll stay with the movement. But I certainly understand anybody who wants to be cynical about this. It's very hard not to be, and certainly at this particular point in our history. On the other hand, there are good things happening. Now, all those groups I mentioned, Médecins Sans Frontières, Physicians Without Human Rights, even the Bill Gates Foundation, we got NGOs, non-governmental organizations, taking strong work. Can you rely just on governments to do this? The answer is absolutely not. We know that, absolutely not. Can non-governmental organizations do it alone? No, but they can inspire other people to do it. Do we need to somehow figure out how to engage the multinational corporations? Absolutely. I think that's going to be the key to global development in the future. How we do that's a big challenge. We don't just do it by passing declarations, but the declarations do set forth the goals, and I think that's what they're good for.
Professor Annis, I have two questions. One of the things you do in this talk is try to perhaps move us to your side, to action. But the specter of Nuremberg in Germany raises the issue of collective national or popular responsibility for crimes, not only of selected leaders. And when you look at the U.S. now, and you wonder, you talk about this as the administration, but one of the startling things now is that there is so little sustained popular outrage at what's happening now. Nothing like the civil dissent and protest during the Vietnam era. And on that basis, wouldn't there be a basis for saying that the public is kind of acquiescing and supporting it? Related to that, I noticed you didn't talk much about courts and bringing about change. And all of the Nuremberg, all of this has to do, of course, with the tension between natural and positive law. To what extent do you think this is still natural law and ideals? And what's the evidence that our courts are trying to make this into hard law that in the U.S. today?
Okay, those are both good questions. First of all, I don't believe in collective responsibility. I don't think the Germans were collectively responsible. We got to try individuals for what they did as individuals, On the other hand, are the Americans being unethical? Yeah. Are they acting illegally? We're just typical Americans, right? As long as it doesn't concern us, we don't care. That's American pragmatism, right? What's in it for me? Unfortunately. Not that that's good. But what about the courts? And is this real law or pretend law? Is this natural law? I mean, Nuremberg was based on natural law. There's no question about it. But once the Nuremberg judges said this is the law, that was real law. But it was real only in the sense if we had a court that could enforce it, right? And that's why all the prosecutors at Nuremberg spent their life trying to set up this international criminal court. Now we have one, but we won't join it, right? Because we don't commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. That's something other people do. So we don't want anybody to have jurisdiction over us. So that leaves our Supreme Court. You're absolutely correct. And our court has only looked at those 3 cases a year ago. And, those were pretty good decisions, but in the end left a lot of discretion to the administration. And the administration ran with it and didn't do anything. So now we're back in court again. They've just taken the Hamden case, as you know. And they're going to tell us, I think they're going to have to tell us whether the Geneva Conventions apply. Of course they apply. It would be an insane decision to think they don't. Their international law, of course, consistently said international law is our law. The only question whether Guantanamo is some kind of legal black hole where the U.S. doesn't have jurisdiction. And I think the court clearly said that's not the case in those last opinions. But you're right. We've got to wait for the U.S. Supreme Court. And they're very, very slow. And the idea that they're not the most conservative court in like the last 100 years is ridiculous. But I think even that court believes in law. That's one thing I think the court does believe in. And international law is real law. They've said that over and over again. The Geneva Convention is real law. The Convention Against Torture is real law. I don't see how they can't reverse the Roberts decision when he was in and say that was wrong, that the president can't do whatever he wants just because he's, quote, commander-in-chief. That can't be the law. As Senator O'Connor, unfortunately she's leaving the court, has said very clearly, right? Commander-in-chief doesn't mean that our citizens are all soldiers and you can tell them to do whatever you want to tell them. So we're relying on our court. Ultimately, we got no choice.
Hi, Professor Annis. Thank you so much for your talk. The one big question mark left in my mind is when you say that we can't rely on governments, we need to look to our NGOs. Well, The problem is there's a feedback loop wherein NGOs are being funded by our government, specifically the USAID. And one of the examples that really concerns me is the removal of condom education internationally. For example, Uganda, where the USAID take the credit for the reduction in Ugandan HIV and AIDS infection rates. However, that reduction occurred prior to the removal of condom education. And yet we're able to create and enforce policy that the NGOs have to go along with. So how do we break this cycle?
Well, that's a real problem, right? I mean, that's a real problem. I mean, NGOs that take government funds, I understand a lot of them can't do their work without government funds, but that's a big problem in its own. I mean, lots of NGOs won't touch government funds, and rightfully so, because they're afraid of government control, just like this. But it's unconscionable for the United States to be telling people in the rest of the world that they can't use condoms to protect themselves against HIV. There's just no justification for that. But it's a political problem now, right? We have to tell the government that. Otherwise, they're going to do it. Otherwise, they're going to listen to the people they do talk to, which is just, as far as we can see, 10 to 15% of religious fundamentalists who believe that. Not all religious fundamentalists believe that either, by the way, so it's just a small group of that. But they're very, very influential. And unless someone stands up to them, they win. I mean, so that's politics. All right, that's politics. But if you're running an NGO, you want to try to figure out if you can get your money somewhere else than from the U.S. government for the foreseeable future if you're involved in family planning or AIDS. Yeah, it's too bad.
You brought up the problem earlier about the patients that are dying for a cure. And at what point do you, at least in America, we live in the age of like instant information, at what point do you blame the ignorant? I mean, stop blaming the doctor, stop blaming the government. When do you blame the person themselves for falling trap to these?
Well, it's a very good question. I've actually called this mutual self-deception. It's in the interest of both the doctor, scientist, and the patient subject to believe that they can be cured, all right, and to believe that they're not going to die. Not, very few of us want to die, and if you have a catastrophic illness that you think might be cured, and now we're going to ask you, well, what percentage? 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, 1 in 10,000, and I've talked to people in this situation. For them, 1 in 10,000 is better than the chance they think they have without it. I'm serious. They say, well, I don't have any chance now. If I get 1 in 10,000, I want to take that. It may depend on how much it costs and where they have to go for it and what the side effects might be. But now we're at the slide about immortality now and our inability as Americans to deal with death. And that's a deep personal thing, a deep cultural thing, and it's one of the reasons why we don't have a decent healthcare system in the United States, because we can't say no to anybody, at least anybody who has money, and we don't think we can set up a system that has limits if we covered everybody because of that. One more, my God, okay. All right. Two more. Thank you.
Evening, Professor.
Sure, I'll try to give short answers, and everybody will be happy then, yeah.
Well, as we all know, the human race has come a long way in terms of breaking down social stigmas and racial stigmas and trying to adhere to a lot of these concepts that are ethical in terms of the Declaration of Human Rights, etc. And even the United States as one of its largest proponents. But the minute that the United States was threatened, its own security, its own people, the question of whether we can actually torture people actually came up, even though we are one of the largest proponents of human rights. So my question to you, Professor, is, in your opinion, do you think we as a race still have hope to be ethical?
Hope to be ethical? Oh, boy. We can make mistakes, The important thing is to recognize this as a disastrous mistake and to repudiate it. All right. I think the U.S. Senate, I know the U.S. Senate took the first step in doing that. We get the president and the vice president now are very weird. The president did say 2 days ago in Panama, we do not torture. Like I'm not a crook, but. And today, he said, after the attacks in Jordan, he said that the attackers don't have a heart and don't have a conscience. And I think he's right about that, but hopefully he would turn that around and see whether we have a heart and whether we have a conscience. I mean, right, the attackers don't, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't. And I have some hope for that only because of the U.S. Senate vote, that this could turn around. All right, this could turn around. And because because most Americans don't believe in that. They do believe in human rights. They do believe that torture and murder are war crimes and crimes against humanity. All right, that should never be done. So I haven't lost hope.
Thanks for squeezing me in. I have a medical ethics question.
Oh, God, okay.
Sorry. I was wondering if you think the scientific community should use the data collected from the Nazi experiments, because on the one hand, we don't want the victims to have died in vain, but on the other hand, we don't want to validate the experiences being conducted in the name of science.
Yeah, I mean, it's an old debate. It's a good debate. My own view on that is different than a lot of people. I'd listen to the survivors and let them tell me. And when we had our conference here back in 1989, Eva Kor came. She's one of the survivors, and basically she said, if it can help anyone else, use it. Other people say no. You should never use it. The compromise position is probably the right position. I don't think it can help anybody, save any lives. There's some people argue about the hypothermia data, whether that can help people or not. But if you ever use it, you have to write an accompanying editorial saying that this is unethically obtained. The people who obtained it should never get any recognition from medicine at all. And the only reason we're doing this is because we know or believe it can help X, Y, Z and save their lives. All right? But it's an interesting question. In some senses, it's not a relevant question, because if you look at the literature, the Nazi data, what there is of it has been used already in the literature. I mean, there are people that actually quote Mengele, if you can believe that or not. But it's a right thing to think about. The way you want to think about it today is, suppose someone cured cancer, or a particular kind of cancer, by killing 20 babies. What would you do with that cure? I mean, you'd like to say we'd bury it with the guy, but you wouldn't. You'd want to use that cure to help the other babies in the world, and we should. The only question is you don't give that guy the Nobel Prize, you put that guy in jail for the rest of his life, but you take his cure. Seems to me. All right.
I think the applause is fitting recognition for a wonderfully stimulating lecture. And I'd like to, on behalf of Boston University, present two things to Dr. Annis. One is a plaque that commemorates, it's a plaque of the advertisement for the...
designed by my sister.
Designed by her sister. This is very nice. And second, a small token from us.
Very nice.
Thank you very much.